Good morning and welcome to the BlackUSA.News morning show. I'm joined
Good
by,
morning. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Rebecca?
Very well. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Welcome to our platform. Tell us about the Maryland DC Press. Goes back to
Oh,
1908.
yes. So we're the trade association for news media organizations in Maryland, Delaware, and DC. We primarily, there's a broadcasters association that handles mainly radio and TV, although we're big tent kind of people. So we feel like we're stronger together. So our bylaws allow us to include any news organization that uses professional standards of journalism, and it allows membership regardless of platform, because journalism is critical today, informing communities, making sure people have access to objective information. That is, that's a bedrock of our society. So we want to support those who are doing the hard work.
Rebecca, the media has been referred to as the fourth estate. Would you agree?
Well, I think it is a critical component of our society. When you think about the role of journalism and newspapers, I guess from a longstanding perspective, they're the places that people come together to talk about what's important to them, to gain information. So I do feel like it is a critical aspect. The other thing that I would also notice that news organizations are, it's important to have them really focus and be a watchdog on the systems of power in our society. News organizations and journalists really shine light in places that I think other perhaps other parts of government or those in power would prefer to keep shrouded.
So you cover Maryland, DC, Delaware also?
Correct. Yeah. So those are all kind of smaller jurisdictions, and we find that our members have a fair amount of overlap just geographically in where they cover. So, in looking at our membership, and all this is on our website, which is mddcpress.com. Sort of our largest, showiest members are the Metro dailies like the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, the Wilmington News Journal. But we have publications that really run the gamut, to online-only news sites like the Baltimore Brew, to niche publications like the Daily Record or the Afro or the Jewish Times. Really, if you're doing good journalism in the world, we're here to support.
So I have to acknowledge Jake Oliver, former publisher of the
Yes.
Afro, for making this connection for us. Jake.
I do, and actually, the current publisher of the Afro, Tony Draper, is just a powerhouse. Jake is fantastic. He actually sits on our foundation board. So the Press Association is a trade organization. We have a foundation, a 501c3, that supports young journalists through internships, does things around supporting the First Amendment, runs some training. And so he has been a longtime member of our board of trustees, and we really value his opinion in addition to the work.
Rebecca, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is about what's happening since the internet age. What's happened to journalism today, over the past 20 years, in particular, AOL, MySpace,
Mhm.
Gmail, the digitalizing of social media, of
Right.
just news in general. Today, television stations have their Twitter handle on the screen, or reporters, they often have their handles. What has happened to media, to news media through the past 2 decades or so?
Well, you know, media in many ways is a reflection of the communities that they serve. So just as, you know, I personally feel like there's so many inputs, there's so many sources of information, and that can be used for good. It can also be used. It can also really be detrimental to me personally, but also the world, kind of thing. I think news media over the past, you know, since the internet age, it definitely challenged media's traditional role as a gatekeeper. So when you look at media, it was like there's an accepted framework of facts, and a lot of that came from, oh well, if the news media said, if the newspaper said, if it was printed there, then yep, that's the way it is. As we look at the bias that people bring to the work and whatever they do, you realize, gosh, you know, that's not
Black and white.
always it's not always the truth. And so I think in some ways the internet age has opened up opportunities for bigger reach for news media. It's certainly opened up ways to tell stories in different ways. I mean, the idea of having data journalism and visualizing data in different ways rather than just really dry and kind of boring charts, or allowing people to be filmed or videoed to tell their story as opposed to having it go through the filter of a quote. You know, all those I think are really interesting ways to go about telling the story. And we'll get into the economics of how the internet has affected news media, but just from a pure kind of journalism perspective, once you know, as an industry, we kind of wrapped our heads around like these are the tools, these are new tools. Then I think you're seeing really unique and interesting ways to go about journalism, because if you look at it, if you just kind of like brush away all these ideas of like the format, journalism is telling objective stories on topics that matter, that are important to readers or viewers or audiences, I guess is the best way to put it. And so if you really, and you're using an accepted and professional kind of code of conduct and standards, none of that has anything to do with format. So sometimes we all get hung up in like, oh my goodness, you know, like this new format. But news media, newspapers in general have been around since the founding of our country. The idea of journalism, we see journalism programs growing and increasing the number of students that they serve and graduates that they serve. They might not all go out and become professional journalists, but being in the industry, you totally know you want a journalist on your side no matter what. They are going to be skeptical. They're going to ask good questions. They're going to have critical thinking. They're going to be on deadline. You know, they are going to make it happen, and they can write really well and communicate very well. Now, economically, so from like the idea and profession of journalism, I think the internet has brought a lot of good. It has also been really destabilizing because it was an industry that, you know, as a primary gatekeeper of information, is now having to contend with citizen journalism, bloggers in the basement, you know, all these, and fracturing the advertising landscape, which it is expensive to produce news, not free. And I hear all the time like, oh, well, you know, just print it on the internet. It'll be free. And that's not the case, because you're relying on people's data gathering, their reporting skills. And I don't know about you, but people don't work for free. And it's not,
I don't work
we
for
shouldn't
free.
expect that. Exactly. Don't work for free. And so the idea that everything should be free on the internet is something that I think news media has really struggled with. And you're seeing more paywalls. You're seeing more, making sure that news media is being compensated for their content, like Google and Facebook. Big fans of just saying, oh, well, we're helping you reach a wider audience. We're going to use your content. And that is not always successful if you want to actually have content, good content, because it takes a lot to report on it. So, advertising has traditionally
Rebecca,
paid those bills.
could
Sorry,
you?
I get passionate.
No. Could you repeat that?
That advertising pays the bills, or that Google and Facebook are taking our lunch because they're using our content for free?
An impact of this new digital age is monies that would traditionally go to a newspaper, to a television station, to a radio station. Some of those funds, many of those funds, are now going to the digital media. That's your point?
Absolutely. And they're not digital media in terms of digital news gathering media. So, a lot of our online only publications, they're not seeing this huge influx of advertising dollars. The lion's share of those dollars are going to Google. They're going to Facebook. They're going to, AdWords and things like that. They're not going to news. Like I don't know how many advertisers you're really pulling in on your YouTube channel, and that can be, and YouTube does help, but you're not a threat to Google and Facebook in terms of their economic security. And so when we really think about where those dollars are going, they're going to these large corporations that are not giving back in the same way that news media gives back, because they're not informing community. They're aggregators of content, and there's a real value to that, but it's not, they're not compensating the creators of that content. So it's a big issue. It's something that the industry is fighting on a federal level for sure.
As you were talking, what comes to mind is a story we ran. I don't know if you've ever heard of Color of Change. They're out of New York. It's a nonprofit. They do a lot of advocacy. But they were reporting on an antitrust suit against Facebook for essentially destroying their customer base. They were saying that they were alluding to the day that Facebook went down. Was this a month ago, 6 weeks ago? It went down for a day. And the antitrust lawsuit, or the letter that Color of Change wrote, spoke to how much dominance Facebook has in the advertising department. So they were saying that if Facebook goes down one day, it means nothing for them, but for a small business, it could be devastating. And they were essentially reiterating that Facebook is a monopoly. And the way they are currently operating is anti-American.
And I think there's a lot to it, and we're all sort of it's when you hear about people, even sort of like that movement, like don't buy from Amazon. It is so hard sometimes to really cut that cord. Same thing with Facebook. It is such a monolithic platform. It's not like you can go to Instagram. Facebook owns Instagram, so it is.
And Google owns YouTube.
Exactly right. So it is very difficult to kind of maneuver in that space. But we are seeing legislatively there's a big push. Certainly in Maryland, there's a desire to kind of stand up to the Facebooks and Googles of the world. A couple years ago, like the digital advertising tax that went into effect this past spring is really directed at having sort of those on Facebooks and Yahoos and whatnot pay their fair share in terms of taxes. Now there is a news media exemption for that, so that having your advertising in your newspaper or that website is not taxed in the same way. And that's really important. But I think it also shows that legislators are really thinking about how to make sure that the big tech platforms really are contributing in some meaningful way, rather than just sucking all the money out of the state and taking it somewhere else.
I'm a big student of media, and I look at various pages, and it's always amazing if you consider LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, I'm always curious as to what social media a news outlet uses. There's one weekly newspaper, as you call it, a niche newspaper. And, when I look at some of their social media followings, they aren't that great. And I've always tried to figure out, how can you have a newspaper and your social media following is very small?
Mm-hmm.
I don't get it.
It is, and I think it goes back to, you have to, as a news media organization, you really have to be looking at where your audience is. So, when we talk about the audience, it used to be all about circulation or all about viewers or whatnot, and now it's this kind of combined audience, because you also, just from an advertising standpoint or a branding standpoint, you need to be in multiple places so that you are accessible to people wherever they are. It's about the content and it's about the audience and connecting them. So it may be that some people look at you only on your website, like they go directly to afro.com. Some people, and just because of Jake Oliver and because of where we are, we'll look at the Afro. They have an amazing Facebook following. They
Damn near a million. What, 650,000?
right, and so that they're reacting to the community that they serve is. So they'll do
I gotta tell you,
Facebook Lives.
Jakey is the one that told me to get on Twitter. This was about 11 years ago. Jakey Oliver.
Yep, you heard it here first. So I think they've been, and many of our members have been very savvy about going to where their audience is. Now, whether that ultimately translates into dollars to keep the news operation, whether there's enough dollars there to keep that news operation running, is always a different side of the story. Just because, again, kind of having that race to the bottom in terms of what those rates are. So I wouldn't say that anybody has a lock on knowing, like, this is what you do. Like, the playbook has kind of been thrown out the window. In some ways, that's kind of exhilarating because you can try different things. There's not one way to do anything. And it recognizes that people are different. Individuals, are bringing their own independence and sort of thoughts to the process, and that your audience is in different places. And I think, going back to kind of the blessings of the internet, we have an opportunity to reach people that wouldn't necessarily have picked up a newspaper, but you're injecting that fact-based, informed, objective journalism into a space where, it used to be like you had to pick up a newspaper, you had to tune into the 6 o'clock news, you had to do whatever. Now, I think it is more accessible. It's just the business model is not entirely worked out.
Where are you based? Are you in?
I'm personally in Baltimore.
Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Baltimore City, proud resident for a million years.
So I've been doing a bit of a comparative analysis between Fox and the other major networks in Baltimore, 11, 13, and 2.
Mm-hmm.
While Fox is hated by some, last year they were doing, I would say, 7 hours more news each week than their competitors.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I hadn't realized that.
4 a.m. news show, 4 p.m. news show. I think Channel 13 is now shifted to a 4 p.m. slot because that's going into prime time. The evening shows, of course, that costs more money. What I'm getting to is, have you noticed the game is changing? I mean, where the Fox is asked, Why is it Fox is asking questions that the other mainstream news outlets are not?
To be honest, I don't. TV is not as deeply ingrained into our association, so I don't have a lot of access to what they're thinking. Um, but it should, you know, I wonder, and it's all about ratings. You know, with TV, again, they clued in so early, like there's cause and effect. You know, wherever the viewers go, that's going to change how all the stations are approaching their work. And people want to know what's going on in their local community. I mean, like, it all starts in your own backyard. You might not care about what happens, you know, in another time zone, but you care about, you know, zoning changes in your neighborhood, what your schools are doing, what the crime rate is, how people in power are using that power, because it affects your pocketbook, it affects your standard of living, it affects your house, you know, prices. And so Fox is really savvy to remember that it's all local at the end of the day. I don't, but it's all about, you know, are you able to do that with an objective sense of coverage?
Oh,
And I think sometimes that's what people worry about with that station.
I'm not expecting objectivity over there. There's clearly some kind of agenda, but what I'm also getting to is, as the internet has come on, for the Baltimore Sun, you get 2 free links per month. Otherwise, you have to pay them.
Right.
Prior to the internet, you get a newspaper, you read the newspaper, much less than it is today. But if you're going to get continual news from the Baltimore Sun, you have to pay them. Where television stations, to me, more of the burden has been put on them to report the news. But here in Baltimore, 13 and 11 get a lot of their news from the Baltimore Sun. So I'm just saying that the game is changing. I don't know that Fox ever quotes the Baltimore Sun.
I don't know. I'm not. I don't watch that much TV, to be honest. So it's hard to sort of know what they're doing. But when you hear, you know, TV and radio are often using newspaper reports as the basis of their reporting. There's also, you know, I think you have to. It is all about how can you follow the money, and when you are. I think it's been said many times, you know, if there's no charge, if it's free, then you're probably the product that's being sold, you know, as an audience. So understanding, you know, that there's a lot of promoted news, there's a lot of sort of special guest reports from a company that's paying for that spot. That happens a lot. Yeah. And just like product placement in feature films is now kind of the new way to get the message across, and influencers and whatnot, that happens a lot in visual mediums, and so I think people are more sort of like accept that more readily, and don't necessarily notice that it's not an unbiased or an objective, that it's not news, you know, that it is sponsored content. And that's a real concern.
One last thing about TV news, and you put it out there, that's not your forte per se, but one thing I noticed about Fox, they run the same story over and over and over, repetition.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you know, you say something enough and it becomes very real to people, even if it's just totally true, beyond the pale. Yeah. You know, it just then becomes part of the accepted, oh, I heard that on this program, and that's where I do think it can be like, news is not always sexy. You know, it can be super boring to like sit through the city council meeting and hear them talk about this budget or that budget. It's really important. You know, it will affect you. Somebody needs to be like, I personally don't want to go to those meetings. So I'm so grateful to have a news reporter who's going to do that and tell me what I need to know. But it's not always, it's not always sexy. And I think the challenge in TV news is that they've got to fill X amount of space, and they're doing it kind of any way that they can to feed that beast. And with the fracturing of that media landscape, that you have to make sure your Twitter feed is up and your Facebook feed is up, and that you have your YouTube and your podcast and your print publication and all of those things. They're all mediums that have kind of specific requirements and need to be filled. And so it can be just exhausting, not only to have all those inputs, all that information kind of flying at you, but also to have, as a journalist, to try and fill all those pieces. So in some ways, my heart goes out to TV news, because you can't sit up there at the anchor desk and have nothing to say. I mean, that's tough.
Let me get to it. Young people. How do we get more young people involved in journalism? I find it one of the most daunting tasks on earth, finding new journalists.
You are so not alone. Like every member I have, especially right now, it is, especially, we're coming off a couple of years where journalists in some ways were kind of demonized. It is, and we're also coming off in this area of the Capitol Gazette shootings. That was just a few years ago. The trial just concluded. And so in the back of everybody's mind is like, it's not just maybe somebody trolling you, it's somebody, perhaps shooting at you.
Did you know any of them, any of the victims?
Well, of course, the Capitol Gazette is a member of the association. We actually, there was a press association meeting in that building. Just, our executive committee met in their offices the day of the shooting and had been out. That was in the morning. So it was a huge loss. I mean, the editors had been a big part of our community for a long time. And it was a huge blow for, the journalism community is small, and everybody knows everyone. So it was definitely a situation that everyone is still recovering from. And I don't know if you ever really recover.
Like they could have been me.
Yeah. Because every journalist has received, the trolling comment, the threat, that's just part of the job. And I think for many years, no one really took that seriously, but there are a lot of guns in our world. There's a lot of, escalating violence across the board. It's not, journalists are not immune from workplace violence, obviously. And there are many industries or many people that don't feel safe in places that you would think or you would hope that they could feel safe. I mean, you see it just across the community. But getting back to young people, because it is, I think,
it's not sexy to them anymore.
Well, so I know our journalism schools have.
And they want to get paid. They don't want to do any volunteer work. No volunteer. I want to get paid out the break.
Right. Well, and that is, I personally am of two minds there. If you want to value this work, like, yes, it should be paid. Like we have a small internship program that offers paid internships for students to intern in member newsrooms. I do see that our journalism schools do have stronger enrollment. Obviously what Jackie Jones is doing over at Morgan and Dwayne Wickham before her with the School of Global Journalism. I love to see that growing and building.
But there's a component missing. And that's
what do you think is missing there?
Entrepreneurship.
In
2021, I want to produce more media entrepreneurs than I do journalists.
So tell me why. Tell me what's going on for you with that.
Because you can make your own living.
Mm-hmm.
if you have a computer. You have people who have started a website 3 years ago, and they've got. I'll give you one example: is the Black Wall Street Times, brand
Hmm.
new. They've got nearly 1 million followers on social media. They have nice staff out in Tulsa, maybe 7 or 8 people, video people. The game is changing, and
Hmm.
even more so. And we haven't talked about it. Are newspapers surviving?
I think they're changing. I mean, they are definitely surviving, and I think the media landscape is richer. I mean, like the Black Wall Street Project, I mean, is that's hitting a nerve of self-determination and self-sufficiency in the Black community. I mean, when you look at Black Wall Street in Tulsa, um, obviously, the 100-year anniversary of that massacre, that's really coming to the forefront of looking at the kind of the business of news media. So finding a like a vein or a topic or an area that people want to hear about, and going deep with it, I think is really important. I feel like I would want to see media entrepreneurship coupled with journalism, because
Yes.
if you don't have that objective content, you really are just, like you're the next influencer kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, and I do feel like at we are seeing now, the pandemic kind of colors everything, but pre-pandemic, certainly our weekly, our very hyper local publications were the ones that were growing the most, and so I think there's opportunity when I see new publications or new entities coming out. They are usually online only. It's very rare to be like, we're jumping into print, but there's still a real need for print. And I think it also is, I think print will survive, but it's
If they
print
can
and.
survive COVID, they can survive anything, because
Right.
a lot of these newspapers had to cut down on how many papers they were publishing each day
Yeah.
or each week. The numbers went
But
down drastically. There was no way to distribute them unless you had a mailing, a system of mailing the newspaper.
right. And the post office is a tough go right now.
I
Like
would not
that's
want to
it's
be dependent on the post office. I live in 21217. We, some of us, uh, there's mail I still haven't gotten from over the past year.
Oh, I totally hear you. It is definitely rough. And so, but what I think that you're seeing with print is it's print and it's not only print. And that helps because you're bringing a wider variety of people in. Um, but students, actually, I think for me, it's really important. Journalism and news media is only relevant if it reflects the communities that it serves. And so there's a real push now, I think, in many news organizations to make sure that their news staff is diverse enough to reflect the communities that it serves. And when you look at that as kind of a pipeline issue, like you said earlier, students don't want to work for free. Many can't afford to work for free. So if we're just kind of thinking about, okay, if our goal is to have a diverse news reporting staff, how do we get to that? There's training that needs to go into it. So the kids that are going to community college, it's not really great journalism schools necessarily at the AA level. There might be some programs, there might be some concentrations. Usually that's a 4-year degree. So you're already kind of
Right.
winnowing out the opportunity. If, as a baseline to getting into the industry, you have to be able to afford to take a couple unpaid internships,
Yes.
you're further winnowing out who can afford to become a journalist.
I
And I
don't know
think
if I could
that's.
afford it. I knew I couldn't afford to miss those opportunities. One was at BAL Radio, and I thank
Mhm.
God for that experience. Another was my first newspaper gig. It was the Sandtown Winchester Community Newspaper. And
Mhm.
so while it started, they told me off the break, you will have to volunteer. But within a month, within a month, it turned into a paid gig. But there's a certain humility in knowing that I might not get the gig. There was a certain humility that's still with me of knowing you have to give in this world to get, that there are no free rides. And my experience with younger, and I'm thinking of those in my own family. I'm not pointing fingers at the millennials or younger generation, but the young people I have run into have no concept of volunteering, when volunteering has opened some of the greatest doors ever for me. White House, United Nations, international. And here's the thing. In a world where we are fascinated by $300 belts, we don't want to give anything of ourselves. And before our generation, Rebecca, I mean, 40 years ago, there were even fewer paid opportunities. I just think if you want to get into something, you want to get into it bad enough, you'll find a way, including volunteering. And let me just reiterate, volunteering opened up many, many doors, more doors than I would have if I was just waiting on paid gigs.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. I think volunteering is the volunteer work that I have done has been transformational, not just in media, but in life. And I think it's also a wonderful way to dip your toe into an area that either you don't know a lot about or you're interested in, but you're not ready to take a leap. I mean, volunteering and working in that way is pretty critical. I think also freelancing is something that certainly is an important way to get experience. From our internship program, what we found, we did a survey of editors and what they were looking for in their new hires. Like when they're hiring entry-level journalists, they want, and this is, I guess, within the paradigm of online news or newspaper worlds. So they want to be able to see your clips. You have to actually have the core skills to be able to do it. They want a recommendation from someone they know. So it means you need to have worked in the world, and they want to know that you can do the work. And I think, those are not big surprise, like, oh, here's the reveal on what people are looking for. Those are all really sensible things that an employer wants out of a potential hire. And the best way to get those three things, the published clips, the real world experience, and the recommendation from someone is to do an internship, whether it's paid or unpaid, whether it's it's something that says, I am learning here and I'm taking that feedback and going to gather on it. So many of our different Department of Labor standards require internships to be paid nowadays. So I think that complicates things a little bit. It's not as easy as just saying, hey, I'll work for free this summer, use me however you can. So it's something we've, from a foundation level, which our foundation is a nonprofit, we're actually right in our fundraising cycle now to fund our internships for next summer. But we want to make sure that we're increasing the pathway for students who economically might not have been able to take on an internship. That's why we pay our interns, because we want to make sure that it also is real. Like when money changes hands, it suddenly is like, this is a real job. Like I have commitments. It's not just like, oh, I thought I could come in, but I can't. So sorry.
I will share this with you. Eddie Brown of Brown Capital Management. He has the Ivy Hotel, has helped. He's donated a lot of money to Micah. Eddie Brown said from a business standpoint, and he was just talking to business owners, he said you should have the best compensation package in the region. And I've taken it to heart. So if I do hire people to do work for me, I want to pay them better than anyone else around, because I want them to come back when I call them again.
Right. No, and that is critical. So
you get what you pay for. You want the best, you got to pay the best.
Well, exactly. And it just makes it more real. So I'm really proud of our internship program. We have had, and we've done a lot recently to really reach out to students who might not have considered themselves journalism, because what you need to be a good journalist, you need to be that nosy neighbor. You need to want to know. You need to be able to follow the rules of objectivity, fair reporting, sourcing. There's a wonderful code of ethics, actually, that SPJ has, that we have absorbed into the Press Association as well. But we need more, I guess, journalistic style people. You may not always be a working journalist, but those critical thinking skills, skepticism, and wanting to know more and holding people accountable, that's what we need more of in the world. So we just want to make sure that we're kind of providing that opportunity to as many people as we can.
I just want to take a moment to say hello to Michael Randolph down in Tampa, Rico, Paul, also Andy Havas. She's on screen. Andy is actually in Hungary.
Oh.
And she's a regular follower of this page. So good morning, everyone. So what have you been working on as of late, Rebecca?
Well, I think what precipitated you reaching out to me was our work with our Hall of Fame. So we, in an unprecedented move, expelled someone for the very first time from our Hall of Fame. So a little background on that. The Press Association has a Hall of Fame which honors outstanding contributors to journalism and the business of journalism within our region, so Maryland, Delaware, and DC. It was started in 1947, and it recently came to light that Dr. Edward Clark, who was the editor and owner of the Worcester Democrat, which has kind of evolved, changed hands, and is still in operation today under a different name. He was the owner from the 20s through 1953 when he passed away. In 1940, just had a series of just scathing, racist, horrible editorials and news coverage around a murder in Pocomoke City and an attempted lynching of two women who were taken in for questioning. This episode came to light through reporting through the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, which is held at the University of Maryland. They are doing, I think, a fantastic series called Printing Hate about the role of white newspaper publishers in fomenting racial hatred. That is, you can just hashtag Printing Hate and find it. And it's a series that they've been working on with, it's a national series. They've been working on it with some HBCU students. So it's meant to be a really sort of groundswell wide effort. And they've been dropping a news story or I guess a profile or an examination every Monday. And we'll do that, I think, through the end of the year. And so one of the students at the University of Maryland, Gabe Pietrorazzo, I'm sure I've butchered that name, but Gabe brought to light that Dr. Clark had written these things, and not just one, it would be reprehensible, even one small article in one issue, but he doubled down. It wasn't just a one stray comment. It was really kind of horrifying and disturbing to see that out there. And so he brought that to light, and our executive committee examined the primary materials, because that's what you do when you're a journalist. You don't just take someone's word for it. And just recognize that his views, comments, writing, news reporting were not the ideals of the association. And so they recommended to our board to expel him from the Hall of Fame. The board concurred. And so that took effect, I think it was last Monday, the 8th. And I think that, in context, there's a real reckoning afoot across the country, a rightful reckoning about words matter. They really do. And the importance and role of newspapers and general media about the stories that we were telling about members of our community. Um, right now, this kind of for us came in context to look at our Hall of Fame and who's in it and who's more importantly who's not in it. Um, Actually, back to Jake Oliver, members of the Murphy family are in fact in the Hall of Fame. The Afro has been a long time member of the association, and it's such a wonderful story to tell. But we're also missing a lot of stories and a lot of contributions. So this this incident kind of came up within the context of us already talking about the Hall of Fame and how it can be more inclusive. And I think the Printing Hate series comes up as many newspapers are looking at their own past, but also their current practices. You know, the idea of printing mugshots and kind of demonizing the Black community, and being much more mindful about making sure that there are Black people in good stories, in the good news stories, in the helping stories. I know the Sun has particularly been very interested in this and doing a lot of work in this area, and the conversation's ongoing. I mean, it's not. I would never sit and say like, oh yeah, we got it all figured out. Like life is good, we're all happy, because we live in America and we're working through it every day and just trying to
I
do the
want to
best we can.
commend you and the MDDC Press for making this an issue. I thank you for addressing it. Edmund Burke comes to mind. He said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men, women to do nothing. So thank you
And that's
for
so
taking the
true.
lead.
Well, I appreciate that, and it is in some ways, although it's difficult to think, oh gosh, we were an organization that this man had, this was not his only. I think there was a pattern there when you go back through some of the archives. It is disturbing to think that, okay, we're an association that such a small community, those who approved him for the Hall of Fame had to know what he was. And I think it's a really strong reminder that we all have to kind of examine our past and what we're doing and sort of the legacy we're leaving in the world. And that's not a, oh, we have to scrub every mention um, of racism or times that we've been unjust. And to that end, as journalists, we didn't wipe Dr. Clark out of the Hall of Fame. Like, it's very clear that we link to our resolution and our article on this person and this process, because we want it to be clear. Like, you need that transparency, you need that context. And for us, it was really important to make sure that we were kind of like, in a newspaper article, you would next day run the correction, and in some sense, this is our correction that we're writing. And more importantly, we have to recognize the work isn't done. It's not like, this isn't just, oh, okay, everything's fine. We need to put it in the context of how can we be more reflective of our wider community, which is why we do all the work that we do through the foundation with our internship program. This is also like, how can we look back and tell a more accurate story of journalism in our region? So it comes within all this. There's never anything that's devoid of context, I guess is the best way to put it.
I still commend you because, we're in a day and time when many people want to forget the past, or, critical race theory is coming about, and I still don't know what it is. The facts are the facts, the truth is the truth, and anything else, hey. But, I wanted to share this with you that, well, I wanted to get your thoughts. Let me lay the premise. I'm sure you've heard of Billy Murphy, the attorney. He has
Of
a
course.
brother, or he had a brother, Arthur Murphy. He regularly took journalists to Jordan. And so I was able to go with them back in '02 to Jordan. We went all throughout the country. What I remember was falling in love with BBC. And I'll tell you why. You know, you look at the world map, you got Jordan, you've got Israel, you've got Syria, Saudi Arabia, all of that, right? All of these countries right up on each other. So you're there in Jordan, you're watching the television. And what I realized for the first time, I never would have realized it here in the United States because we are geographically isolated.
Right.
What I realized right there, that all of these countries are right in each other's face, and it's much more difficult to tell a lie in front of everybody.
Right. Everybody's watching. Yeah.
Everybody's watching. Oh, that's not what happened. The sky is clearly blue. But here in the United States, we're geographically isolated. I mean, the Canadians, they're partial to French. To the South, people, you know, Spanish is popular, and so it's easy to be one-sided, jaded, pro-American, pro-Democrat, pro-democracy, pro-Republican, whatever. It's easy to be in that mindset as opposed to having a more global perspective. Right. How do we remain objective here in America?
You know, I think we are in a time where people feel like if they think it or if they've read it somewhere that that is so, you know, like that facts are optional. And I don't know if the rest of the world has a lock on facts, but I think we all need to recognize that we can be wrong. You know, that we're in a process of almost like continuous revelation, that we can be open to having new information come in that can radically shift our views, or not even radically, just shift. So I think sort of that hubris of, well, I am right and I will never consider anything else but what I think, is a really dangerous precedent. Right. And I think also sort of in terms of isolationism, that isolationist view of, you know, America feeling like we can go it alone, we don't need anyone else, is something that kind of trickles down at a local level. And seeing your neighbors, your community members, even your family members as individuals rather than like this monolithic other would also be a really an important thing to remember, that we're all kind of, I don't want to be too woo-woo, but like on our own journey and figuring it out. And so if you can come from that place of humility to say, I might not always be right, and I really want to know about what someone else thinks, that I think creates a much stronger way to move forward. And I don't think that we all should disagree. I mean, conflict is a really transformative element in our world. If we didn't have conflict, things wouldn't change. So we need that conflict, but we need to be able to harness it. And rather than saying, oh, I disagree with you on this issue, so I am never going to talk to you again, it would be, I think, a much stronger democracy if we could be able to talk about the substantive issues, sort of the values and topics that are prompting that conflict. See if we can at least understand the other side. You may still disagree, but then you at least can agree to disagree. But a lot of that kind of stems from, you have to recognize that the other person has inherent worth to say, you know, you're worth listening to. And that I also feel like we don't always hit well. I'm not sure the world has a lock on that, but you know, that's sort of the ramble of what I feel like would make the world a better place.
So we have a few minutes left. I did want to ask you one more, and I think it's an important question. women in journalism? Where are we?
We're not where we need to be. I mean, I think when you look at sort of across the board, um, at least in our regional newsrooms, most publishers are men, most top editors are men. I think that there's a push to try and have, and there are more women. You know, there's some fabulous publishers. You know, Tony, of course, is one of them. Lenora Halsey is a great general manager at the Afro. Joy Bramble at the Baltimore Times. Denise Rolick Barnes from the Washington Informer. You know, those are all strong women-led publications. But the major, you know, Suzanne Hutner from the Daily Record, also a strong woman publisher. Fern Shen from the Baltimore Brew. But when you look at,
is Joanna
what's
Sullivan?
That?
Joanna
Sullivan from the BBJ and Rhonda Pringle, actually, yeah. So maybe there's more than I think. It's sort of creeping up. But if you look nationally, the people in charge are still men. You know, like the highest levels of those corporations, those large news entities, you know, Gannett's still run by a man, Alden, sort of all men. So it's not that the women are not, certainly not 50-50 yet, but it is growing, it is changing. And when you look at people of color, you know, like, yes, you have Sam Davis at the Sun, who's doing amazing work. You have all of the Black-owned publications, but you know, aside from that, it's still, you know, we're not where we need to be in terms of reflecting the communities that we serve. And
how do
so,
we get more women involved?
You know, in some ways, I think it's looking at, when you want a demographic to be a part of the group, you have to ask them what's kind of holding them back. You know, we also live in a world where childcare disproportionately falls to women. You know, when you think about the life of a journalist, you go where the news is. You know, it can be very, you can be draining yourself to cover, you know, this investigation that's taking literally all of the bandwidth.
And somebody then call you a bad mommy because you are focused on this assignment. It's not the same for a man. He's
right.
not,
he's like, oh, you're going after your career. This is great. So I think there's still some of that inherent imbalance in the world that makes it harder for women. I think you saw that in COVID, like who was running the homeschool? You know, it wasn't daddy all the time. And there's, I'm sure, more balanced partnerships out there, but there are more single women there are more single moms out there. And I think, you know, it's just a recognition that the workplace is not necessarily equal, and the ways and the caregiving responsibilities aren't equal. And so it's not always easy to see that those positions of power are like, they're not equal because it's endemic of, it's systematic. It's not just, oh, this one industry. What I do see is that we have a lot of female graduates coming out of journalism schools, but at some point they don't seem to continue that arc. You know, like they kind of burn out and find other careers or other places.
Or they start their own.
But although I think it's really important to have that entrepreneurship, to really be kind of creating your own world, there's still a lot of power in the major news organizations. I mean, like, you need a team of people to do substantive investigative reporting because, you know, you're not generating enough support within a newsroom you have to have a story coming out every day. You can't just say, oh, I'll be back in 6 months once my investigative report is done.
Like, if it doesn't make money, it doesn't make sense. Now, I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah. And so I think you need the larger organizations for that large scale investigative work. And so although I really commend people who are kind of doing it on their own, and I think Fern Shen's a great example of someone who has done strong investigatory work and still has a successful daily news site, but it's not easy. And I'm sure she would say, you know, having more people would allow her to do more things. And so that's where our larger news organizations, if you don't have that kind of parity in those organizations, it's a real tough call. Like Sinclair, in publicly owned company and based in Hunt Valley, and Fox News owner, they got their first woman on their board of directors this past year. And when you think about that, that's not changing. One token person doesn't really change the conversation. Studies have shown if you're really going to make change, you need about 3 people of whatever demographic you're trying to introduce to really make that change. So you're in those upper levels, it's still very male, still very white, and that's where we need to look next and kind of hold those groups accountable, because change can come from the bottom, but it comes more quickly from the top.
Well, I have a daughter, and I'm teaching her to take no prisoners. She's been in business for 5 years. She's only 20.
Good. See, what a good dad.
We're out of time, but how can people get it? And thank you for taking time out to speak with us. I feel much more informed about Maryland, D.C. press, covering Maryland, D.C., Delaware, this region. How can people get in touch with you? And thank you.
And thank you so much for having me. This was delightful, and I really enjoyed talking to you. It was great. Our website is probably the best way to keep in touch with us. That's mddcpress.com. If you want to get in touch with me directly, you can reach me at Rebecca R. Snyder. Sorry, I was thinking of a different email. R. Snyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. We also have a weekly newsletter that goes out to the industry. We're also gearing up for the legislative session. We do advocate for news media and First Amendment issues in Maryland, Delaware, and DC. So I hope to come back and talk to you more about what's happening in the session as we move forward into that.
And the governor's race.
And the governor's race. Yes, because, a lot of there's just this thought on the part of government officials that they don't need to share what they're doing with the public. It doesn't happen on with every public official, but it's definitely a concern. So we're always looking on ways to strengthen the Public Information Act. So,
well, however we can be of service to you, please let us know, and we look forward to bring you back in the future to talk about these and other topics.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much. Good to see you.
Good deal. We'll be back 7 p.m. tonight for Black Business Roundtable live from Oakland. Rebecca, top of the world, top of the morning to you. Good morning, world.
Thank you.